Medieval life wasn't a fairy tale. No knights saving the day, no perfect princesses waiting in towers. It was real, rough, and full of rules. If you've only seen the movie version, you've barely scratched the surface. The truth? It starts the moment people open their eyes. Most peasants woke up on straw stuffed into cloth sacks placed on wooden planks. If you were lucky, you had a proper frame. If not, the floor was your mattress. The straw got changed maybe twice a year, so by winter you were sleeping on something that probably harbored more bugs than a cheap motel. Blankets were made from scratchy wool or old clothes sewn together. The medieval version of thread count was basically, can you still see through it? No? Good enough. These patchwork covers felt like sleeping under sandpaper, but were better than freezing to death. Privacy didn't exist. Entire families lived in single rooms, smaller than modern living rooms. But here's the kicker. You shared this tiny space with chickens, goats, and sometimes pigs. The animals provided warmth, but also sounds, smells, and occasional floor surprises you didn't want to step on in the dark. Windows were holes in walls covered with wooden shutters, animal skins, or cloth. Glass was incredibly expensive, reserved for churches and wealthy homes. During winter, you chose between warmth or light. Most people chose warmth, spending months in dark caves. Morning light crept through wall gaps and roof holes. Roosters served as alarm clocks. Families woke up wearing the same clothes from yesterday, last week, and probably last month. Laundry day happened about as often as solar eclipses and was probably just as memorable. The morning routine was simple. Wake up, check if you were still alive, and prepare for another exhausting day ahead. Medieval work schedules made modern jobs look like vacations. No 40-hour weeks existed here. The rule was simple. Sunrise to sunset every day, with brief breaks to shove food in your mouth. Peasants weren't specialists with single jobs. They were farmers, animal caretakers, construction workers, water carriers, wood choppers, and repair crews all in one exhausted package. Every job involved back-breaking labor with tools that made modern equipment look futuristic. Spring meant plowing hard soil with wooden plows pulled by oxen if you owned them. Otherwise, you did the pulling. Summer brought harvesting grain with hand tools under blazing sun. Fall was about food preservation and winter preparation. Winter meant fixing everything that broke during the year while trying not to freeze. Children started careers around age 7, when modern kids are learning to tie shoes and complaining about bedtimes. Medieval children herded animals, fetched water from wells, and collected firewood. Child labor laws were 800 years away from invention. Women worked as hard as men, splitting time between fields and household duties. While men plowed and harvested, women worked beside them, then went home to cook, clean, spin wool, weave cloth, make clothes, tend gardens, milk cows, make cheese, and raise children. The medieval woman's day was longer than a grocery store receipt. Only breaks came on Sundays and religious holidays, totaling roughly 80 to 100 days yearly. These weren't vacation days, but holy days requiring church attendance while still doing essential chores. No sick days, personal days, or mental health days existed. Hurt meant working hurt. Sick meant working sick. The only day off came from literally dying, and families might still prop you up in fields for extra work. Seasonal work brought different challenges, but exhaustion remained constant. By evening, people were too tired for anything besides eating whatever they could prepare. Medieval cuisine made prison food look gourmet. Peasant meal plans had about as much variety as watching paint dry on wooden fences. Every meal starred pottage. Basically, whatever vegetables you found thrown into pots with grain and water. This wasn't carefully crafted stew with herbs and spices. This was survival soup that tastes exactly like survival soup. If boredom had a flavor, it would taste like pottage. Bread was important, but not fluffy white bread we know. Medieval bread was dark, dense, made from rye or barley. It was so hard people used it as plates called trenchers. You knew bread was done when it could double as a weapon. Wealthy people afforded wheat bread, but peasants ate dark bread often containing sawdust or chalk to stretch grain further. Meat was like lottery winnings for peasants. They might see pork or chicken on special occasions like Easter or Christmas, but daily protein came from beans, peas, and maybe eggs if they owned chickens. Beef was unheard of because cattle were too valuable for milk and farm work. Medieval spice racks consisted of salt, and if feeling fancy, maybe herbs you grew yourself. Pepper and spices were worth their weight in gold, literally traded alongside precious metals. People ate with their hands most times, sharing bowls and using knives and spoons when available. Forks weren't commonly used until much later. Table manners were simple: grab what you can, eat fast, and don't take more than your share, or someone might take it back with interest. Wealthy people lived in completely different food worlds, enjoying roasted meats, pastries, wine, and imported delicacies. The contrast between rich and poor was nowhere more obvious than at mealtimes. But when rare moments of leisure did come around, people knew how to make the most of them. Between endless work, medieval people found time for fun, though it was rarer than finding needles in haystacks. Religious holidays and feast days were main entertainment opportunities, treated like winning tickets to the best show in town. Village gatherings were social life highlights. People came together for feasts, fairs, dancing, and games passed down through generations. Medieval parties got wild with drinking, singing, and dancing continuing into the night. Original party animals didn't need DJs, just someone with flutes and strong lungs. Storytelling was huge entertainment. Before common books, people memorized epic tales, legends, and folk stories shared around fires or in taverns. These storytellers were like human Netflix, providing hours of entertainment with hero, monster, romance, and adventure tales. Music filled the celebration air. People played flutes, fiddles, drums, and simple instruments. Everyone knew folk songs, and singing was a group activity. You didn't need talent, just loud enthusiasm. Public competitions were like medieval sports events. Archery contests, wrestling matches, and mock battles drew crowds and created local heroes. Think CrossFit, but with more potential for actual death. Towns had theater versions, usually religious plays performed in public squares or on traveling wagons. Traveling performers were medieval rock stars. Jugglers, musicians, acrobats, and actors arrived on market days, drawing crowds and bringing news from other places. But of course, all this fun had to happen within the strict boundaries of what society considered acceptable behavior. Medieval justice made modern courts look like afternoon tea parties. The punishment philosophy was simple: make penalties so unpleasant and public that people would think twice before breaking laws again. Privacy wasn't part of punishment. Humiliation was often the whole point. Minor crimes got minor punishments, but medieval minor wasn't pleasant. Stealing bread or cheating customers might land you in stocks or pillories in town squares. These wooden contraptions held heads and hands while townspeople threw rotten vegetables, mud, or worse. It was like dunking booth targets, except instead of water, people threw whatever they'd saved in garbage bins. Stocks were designed for discomfort and humiliation. You'd bend awkwardly for hours or days, unable to move, eat properly, or handle bodily functions. Everyone passing could see, mock, and contribute to misery. Theft was serious because most people had so little. Stealing resulted in whipping, hot iron branding, or finger cutting for repeat offenders. Medieval logic was about as subtle as sledgehammers to faces. The idea was simple. Can't keep hands to yourself? Maybe you don't need all fingers. Serious crimes brought serious punishments. Murder, treason, heresy, and major theft could result in hanging, beheading, or stake burning. These executions were public events drawing crowds like medieval entertainment spectacles. Trial systems differed from modern courts. Instead of lawyers and evidence, medieval justice relied on witnesses, oaths, and sometimes trial by ordeal. Without enough witnesses, you might prove innocence by carrying hot iron, walking through fire, or water dunking. Justice was about as consistent as medieval weather forecasting. Prisons weren't punishment tools like today, but holding cells where people waited for actual punishment or trials. Communities couldn't afford feeding and housing criminals for extended periods, so punishments were swift and final. But staying out of legal trouble was just one part of staying alive in a world where spiritual matters governed every aspect of daily existence. Religion wasn't a weekend activity for medieval people. It was woven into every existence moment like tapestry threads. Church bells didn't just mark hours, but prayer times, work times, meal times, and practically every life aspect. If medieval life had soundtracks, they'd be 90% church bells and 10% animal noises. Days started with prayers, continued with prayers, and ended with prayers. People prayed at specific daily times, and church bells ensured nobody forgot. Morning, midday, evening, and meal prayers were routine parts. Forgetting wasn't just rude, but potentially dangerous for eternal souls. Weekly church attendance wasn't optional. Everyone expected mass attendance, and everyone meant everyone. Missing church without really good excuses like being on deathbeds could result in fines, public penance, or other unpleasant consequences. Church buildings were usually largest, most impressive village structures, and Sunday services were both religious obligations and social events. Tithing was basically medieval tax systems, except paid to churches instead of governments. People required giving 10% of crops, livestock, or income to support local churches and clergy. For people barely surviving, giving 10% was serious sacrifice, but it wasn't negotiable. Churches had very effective collection agencies, eternal damnation threats. Church calendars controlled entire years. Religious festivals and holy days determined when people worked, celebrated, and even married. Lent meant weeks of fasting and restricted diets. Easter brought feasting and celebration. All Saints' Day, Christmas, and dozens of other religious observances shaped life rhythms more than government regulations. Monasteries weren't just religious centers, but also hospitals, schools, libraries, and social service centers. Monks and nuns provided medical care, wealthy education, orphan care, and hungry feeding. They preserved knowledge by copying books and maintaining libraries. Monks were basically medieval multitaskers, handling everything from brain surgery to bookkeeping. Pilgrimages were like religious road trips, except much more dangerous and uncomfortable. People traveled hundreds or thousands of miles visiting holy sites, seeing religious relics, or seeking miraculous healing. These journeys took months or years, and many pilgrims never returned home. But spiritual benefits were considered worth risks, and successful pilgrims gained community respect and status. Churches controlled education, medicine, law, and social services. Priests weren't just religious leaders, but often only literate community people, serving as teachers, lawyers, doctors, and counselors. When people did get sick or injured, their options for help were quite limited. Medieval medicine was based on theories making about as much sense as using magic 8 balls for medical diagnosis. The entire system revolved around balancing 4 bodily fluids called humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to medieval doctors, all illness came from having too much or too little of these fluids. Medieval medical mottos were apparently, when in doubt, drain it out. Bloodletting was go-to treatment for almost everything. Headache? Let blood out. Fever? More bloodletting. Broken leg? Might need splints, but probably bloodletting too, just for safety. Doctors used leeches, sharp knives, or special cups removing blood from already weak patients. Herbal remedies were actually sensible medieval medicine aspects. Many plants have genuine medicinal properties, and medieval healers had centuries of trial and error to build on. Willow bark for pain relief, garlic for infections, and various digestive herbs actually worked sometimes. Problems were effective remedies mixed with completely useless or dangerous treatments. Most people couldn't afford actual doctors, who were rare and expensive anyway. Instead, they relied on local healers, midwives, or monks who picked up medical knowledge with religious training. These folk healers often knew more practical medicine than university-trained doctors, mainly because they dealt with real patients instead of just reading ancient books. Medieval doctors had modern politician confidence and about the same success rates. They diagnosed illnesses by examining urine color, checking pulse points, or consulting astrological charts determining best treatment times. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, so most patients died from infections even if operations were technically successful. Common diseases were numerous and deadly. Dysentery killed through dehydration and infection. Tuberculosis slowly destroyed lungs and killed entire families. Various skin infections and parasites made life miserable for almost everyone. Smallpox, measles, and other diseases we vaccinate against today regularly swept through communities. The Black Death, striking Europe between 1347 and 1351, was the ultimate medieval medical disaster. This plague killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population in 4 years. Medical knowledge was completely useless against it. The plague was like medieval reset buttons nobody wanted to press. Sanitation was terrible everywhere except monasteries with better hygiene practices. Most people threw human waste into streets, rivers, or just outside homes. Wells were often contaminated. Food spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Medieval Europe smelled like combinations of barnyards, garbage dumps, and unclean public restrooms. Unfortunately, disease and poor health were just some of the many dangers people faced regularly. Medieval Europe was basically one giant battlefield with occasional intermissions for planting crops. Wars weren't rare special events, but background noise of life, like bad weather or tax collectors. Conflicts between lords, land disputes, succession battles, and foreign invasions meant peace was often just temporary breaks between fights. Most soldiers weren't professional warriors with years of training and fancy equipment. When lords needed armies, they called up local peasants and handed them whatever weapons were available. Medieval military recruitment was basically, congratulations, you're now in the army. Here's a pointy stick. Try not to die immediately. Average peasant soldiers went into battle wearing padded cloth armor, carrying wooden shields, and wielding simple weapons like spears, clubs, or sharpened farming tools. Metal armor was incredibly expensive and heavy, reserved for knights and wealthy nobles who could afford it. Battles were chaotic affairs bearing little resemblance to organized movie formations. Communication was limited to shouting and horn signals. Strategy was often just charge forward and hope for the best. Many conflicts were decided more by luck, weather, or which side got hungry first than superior tactics or training. Castles and fortified towns were built specifically protecting people during conflicts. When raiders or armies approached, everyone in surrounding areas fled to nearest fortifications, bringing animals and whatever possessions they could carry. These sieges lasted months, with both sides waiting to see who would run out of food, water, or patience first. Medieval siege warfare was like the world's most boring and dangerous camping trips. Attackers surrounded castles or towns and waited for defenders to surrender, starve, or die of disease. Meanwhile, defenders shot arrows, poured boiling oil, or threw rocks at anyone getting too close to walls. Crop and livestock destruction during wartime often caused more suffering than actual fighting. Armies lived off land, taking food from farms and villages along their paths. Even if villages were never directly attacked, having armies pass through could leave people without enough food for winter survival. Medieval armies were like locusts with weapons, consuming everything in their paths. Wars dragged on for years or decades, with long, quiet periods interrupted by sudden violence bursts. The 100 Years' War actually lasted 116 years, showing how optimistic medieval people were about conflict resolution. Amidst all this turmoil, different groups of people had vastly different experiences and expectations placed upon them. Medieval women had job descriptions that would make modern multitaskers quit on the spot. Their responsibilities started before dawn and ended well after dark, covering everything from food production to textile manufacturing to childcare, often while also working in fields alongside men. Daily routines for most women involved cooking, cleaning, raising children, tending gardens, caring for animals, and producing all the textiles their families needed. Medieval women were basically one-person factories with no lunch breaks, weekends, or employee benefits. They spun wool into thread, wove thread into cloth, and sewed cloth into clothing for entire families. This wasn't hobby crafting, but essential survival work requiring skill, strength, and countless labor hours. Marriage was rarely about love or choice. Most girls married young, often in early teens, through family arrangements. These marriages were business deals designed to combine land, resources, or political connections. Bride feelings about future husbands were about as relevant as their foreign policy opinions. Medieval dating apps would have been simple. Available for strategic alliance, comes with 2 goats and decent dowry. Motherhood started early and was extremely dangerous. Many women became mothers by age 15 and continued having children throughout reproductive years. Without modern medicine or birth control, pregnancy and childbirth were life-threatening events. Many women died in labor, and survivors often faced heartbreak of losing children to disease, accidents, or malnutrition. Women from wealthy families had different but equally demanding responsibilities. Noble women managed large households with dozens of servants, oversaw estate operations when husbands were away, and handled complex financial and legal matters. They were expected to be skilled in diplomacy, accounting, medicine, and sometimes military strategy. Being medieval ladies wasn't about sitting in pretty dresses, but more like being CEOs of small corporations that happened to have horses. Legal rights for women were extremely limited. They couldn't vote, hold most political offices, or inherit property freely. Women's legal status was usually tied to fathers, husbands, or eldest sons. Marriage transferred women's legal identity to husbands, meaning they couldn't make contracts, own property, or make major decisions without male approval. However, widowhood sometimes brought unexpected freedom. Widows could inherit businesses, own property, and make their own decisions for the first time in their lives. Some became successful merchants, innkeepers, or craftswomen. Medieval widowhood was like finally getting keys to your own life, except you had to lose your husband to get them. Women were excluded from formal education except in religious settings. Most remained illiterate throughout their lives, relying on oral tradition to pass down knowledge about medicine, cooking, childcare, and domestic skills. But even the very beginning of life in medieval times was shaped by harsh realities and difficult circumstances. Growing up in medieval times meant skipping most of what we consider childhood and jumping straight into adult responsibility deep ends. Modern extended childhood concepts, where kids can be kids for years, would have seemed like impossible luxuries to medieval families needing every pair of hands for survival help. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high, with estimates suggesting around 30 to 50% of children died before fifth birthdays. Diseases, accidents, malnutrition, and birth complications claimed so many young lives that parents often waited years before becoming too emotionally attached. Medieval parenting came with constant awareness that children might not see next birthdays, making every milestone feel like winning lotteries you desperately hope to keep winning. Babies were swaddled tightly in cloth strips, keeping them warm and supposedly safe from injury, but also severely restricting movement. This practice was based on beliefs that infants needed complete stillness to develop properly. Modern parents would probably consider medieval swaddling somewhere between protective and mummification. By age 7, children were expected to start contributing to family survival meaningfully. This wasn't child labor as we understand today, but simply reality that every family member needed to work for family survival. Children herded animals, gathered firewood, fetched water, helped with harvests, and learned basic crafts. Medieval children had job responsibilities before having all permanent teeth. Education was extremely rare and mostly limited to wealthy boys and children destined for religious life. Vast majorities of children never learned reading or writing, instead acquiring knowledge through hands-on experience and oral instruction. Parents taught practical skills. Boys learned farming, crafts, or fighting, while girls learned household management, textile production, and childcare. For craft family children, formal apprenticeships usually began around ages 12 to 14. Boys were sent to live with master craftsmen, learning trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, or weaving. These apprenticeships lasted several years and were serious commitments determining children's future careers and social status. Medieval career planning happened while modern kids are still figuring out favorite colors. Toys existed, but were simple and homemade. Children played with carved wooden animals, cloth dolls stuffed with straw, spinning tops, hoops, and simple balls made from inflated pig bladders. Many toys served double duty as adult skill learning tools. Discipline was strict, and physical punishment was considered normal and necessary. Children were expected to show complete respect and obedience to adults, especially parents and religious authorities. Medieval parenting philosophy was basically children should be seen, not heard, and preferably working while being seen. The transition to adulthood happened much earlier than modern times. Girls often married in teens, while boys typically married slightly later after completing apprenticeships or military service. By ages 16 or 18, most young people were considered full adults with adult responsibilities and expectations. There you have it. Life in medieval times was harsh, unpredictable, and nothing like the movies portray, but somehow people found ways to survive and even find moments of joy